Welcome to Exhuming the Truth, a podcast dedicated to cold cases, missing persons, systemic injustices, and the art of forensic science that seeks answers when silence remains. My name is Asha, and I am a forensic scientist and a criminologist, and in each episode, we examine the evidence, the systems, and the human stories often left behind. This isn't just about true crime. It's about truth, it's about accountability, and it's about giving a voice to those who deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here, and let's jump right in. Hi guys, I hope everybody has had a beautiful weekend and everyone is staying safe. I just want to preface with this episode today that it does contain discussions of child homicide as well as suicide and systemic stresses within disability support frameworks. So please listen with care. If you need support, the resources will be shared at the end of this episode and they will also be in the podcast notes. I actually had a different episode scheduled for today, which I have popped on next week's list because I was humming and ahhing about whether or not to do this episode because I was told it would be a bit controversial. But we all know where I stand with that sort of thing. If something's controversial, it kind of makes me want to talk about it more. I understand that with that, obviously, my opinions don't always sit on the best side with people and they might drop off from listening or disappear, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. I don't necessarily, love that people would leave if they disagree with my personal opinion, because I'm still more than happy to have normal discussion around things. But at the end of the day, if that's how people feel, I don't think it's a huge loss to us. I think when I made a post about this on our social media, there were a lot of comments agreeing with what I had to say, which I appreciate so much, and also is a great relief to know that there's obviously other people out there with the same sort of frame of mind as myself, and that's always one that comes with compassion and, the right thing, I suppose. There was, of course, a lot of nasty comments, but we have got those pretty much under control. So I do know that with doing this episode, there's going to be a bit of that. So if you see it happening in the comments, just kind of flag it with me and I'll try and get rid of it. But yeah, I am well aware that I'm opening the gateways to hell with this, but I think it's a very important discussion to have, so I'm going to do it anyway. Welcome to the Mosman Park tragedy. This is Exhuming the Truth, and I am Asha Walther, a forensic scientist and criminologist and someone who believes that language is not neutral. I believe that language shapes justice and language shapes funding, and it even shapes whether prevention ever becomes possible. And today we're discussing the family murder-suicide in Mosman Park. So as we know, Mosman Park is in Perth, WA, and we had the recent tragedy of a murder-suicide that ended the life of an entire family. So 2 boys, a mum and a dad, and their pets. So this whole family is gone. The children are gone. The parents are gone. And what remains besides the enormous grief is a narrative. And within hours of this news breaking in Perth, headlines began to harden. Not to anyone's surprise, the media aren't particularly kind. And they were using words like monster and evil and unthinkable or pure horror. And while the horror is obviously very real, the devastation is what's real here. And I want to pause today and I want to examine something that sits underneath the shock, because in criminology, when we stop at outrage, we stop at the surface. And when we stop at the surface, then the prevention dies. And what we're all about is crime prevention, and we want to help. We want to release the pressure of systemic issues, and we want to talk about them. So today's first segment is basically explaining what a murder-suicide is structurally in terms of criminology. A murder-suicide is not simply a murder followed by unrelated suicide or vice versa. Now, in criminological literature, it's actually recognised as a linked behavioural sequence, which is where one act emerging within the psychological trajectory of the other. We had a lot of comments on our public post about how we feel about this tragedy, and people saying, oh, the parents are murderers, which simply is not true. It doesn't exist independently without the suicide. And it's really, really important because there's been research done by somebody called Marzuk in 1992, and it's actually published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which describes murder-suicide as a phenomenon characterized by a single suicidal act extended outwards. So that means that the perpetrator's suicidal intent is central to understanding the structure of events. So that doesn't excuse the homicide whatsoever. It basically just contextualizes the behavioural arc. The homicide does not exist without the suicide. That is a fact. We cannot isolate those two. We cannot say that simply this person is a murderer, because this all happened as one. These events are bound together in motivation and in perception and in crisis psychology, which is something we'll go into another time. But when we isolate the homicide and label the individual solely as a murderer, like I just explained, we're only examining half of the equation here. And if we amputate half the equation, we amputate the opportunity for understanding, which also amputates the opportunity, of course, for prevention. Now, this next little segment I've put together for you is the psychology of familicide, which basically means the loss of the entire family. So family murder-suicide, sometimes termed familicide, like I just said, in criminological research, often follows identifiable psychological patterns. So in 1995, there was a really intelligent group of people by the surnames of Wilson, Daly, and Danielle. And they actually examined familicide and what that is and a big range of familicide-related cases. And they found common threads between all of these cases, which include perceived catastrophic loss, obviously, financial strain, relationship breakdowns, and distorted beliefs about protection or mercy. So that is all a common theme between all the cases that they examined. In cases where there are children involved, the researchers actually documented what's referred to as altruistic filicide. And this is where the parent actually believes in a severely distorted cognitive state that death spares the child from future suffering. Let me just be personally clear for a moment that distortion obviously is not justification, but understanding the distortion is the prevention. So under extreme psychological stress, cognitive narrowing occurs. And when we talk about, if I'm going to go into neurobiology, so that is the biology or the way the brain works, and in neurobiological research, it actually shows that chronic stress elevates cortisol, and this actually impairs the prefrontal cortex functioning, which is a part of the brain that reduces executive reasoning capacity. And that is, somebody's executive reasoning capacity is greatly reduced or affected when they have high cortisol. When this prefrontal cortex is actually responsible for planning and moral reasoning, it's also responsible for impulse control, and that can obviously become compromised under this prolonged stress and this high cortisol, and individuals, more often than not the parents, become more reactive, more catastrophic in thinking, and obviously less capable of flexible problem solving. So they kind of feel like they're in a narrow tunnel towards one direction and there's no way out. So we can confidently combine that in itself with the perceived hopelessness that they were feeling, which is a very strong predictor of suicide identified in, there's a book that has a really strong theory in it called Beck's hopelessness theory. And a very big, strong predictor of suicide in that book tells us that you have a volatile psychological state, and if you are in that state, it's a very big indicator that somebody is more likely than not to commit suicide. I want to also identify here that hopelessness and sadness are not the same. Hopelessness is the belief that the future contains no solutions. And when somebody believes that there's no solution, then they might begin to see death as one in a way. And again, explanation is not exoneration. But if we refuse to look at hopelessness, we will never interrupt it. But why is it so easy for the media to label somebody a monster? And why does it feel easier to do that? Calling someone a monster creates a distance, and it allows us to say that's not human and I could never. But criminology kind of consistently shows that extreme acts are committed by human beings, obviously, not mythical creatures like monsters. Now, a lady named Hannah Arendt, she did an analysis of systemic violence, and she actually described the banality of evil, not to minimize harm, but to emphasize the catastrophic acts that can emerge from ordinary individuals under particular pressures like the ones we've been discussing. And when we dehumanize perpetrators entirely by calling them monsters, we actually protect ourselves in a psychological way, but we then lose the capacity to recognize warning signs in ordinary environments and in ordinary people. And this is really dangerous. And if monsters commit these acts, we don't need to examine stress or systems or even funding like the NDIS or mental health infrastructure or even caregiver strain, which is also a big one here. If humans commit these acts and we make it human, these people we can recognize as overwhelmed and deteriorating and collapsing humans, then we must ask harder questions. And these harder questions demand systemic accountability. I hope you see where I'm going here and showing you how and why language matters and how it's easy to adopt what the media is saying to you, like evil monsters, when that's actually really harmful in the sense of crime prevention. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the NDIS, and the systemic pressure that sort of mountains on top of that. So we have the NDIS, which is Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, and it was actually designed to provide individualised support, it says, to Australians living with disability and their families. And in principle, it sounds great and transformative, but in practice, many families report profound strain navigating this system. Now, the Australian Productivity Commission of 2017 acknowledged administrative complexity and plan inconsistencies. Surprise. So more recent reviews have obviously been done, and that those more recent reviews have documented like a whole heap of things, basically saying that there's heaps of delays, there's funding disputes, there's funding discrepancies, there's an appeals process that they have that are taxing, obviously, for carers and families and emotionally, financially, and these people are already under pressure. So it is not ideal to be completely nice about it. The caregiver burden is not theoretical. So we have also another thing called the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, and that was published in 2008, and it is a very informative journal, and it basically says that chronic caregiving stress increases depression, anxiety, physical illness, and mortality risk, which is something that we hear a little bit, every now and again. But I don't think it's something that people really take seriously enough. I know that when I had my accident as a teenager, my mum lost her job. She became my carer full time. It was very stressful for her. We had no money coming in. She was a single mum. She had to care for me, get me to appointments, obviously needed to still pay bills. It was a very difficult time and it set her back years and years. So this, we can relate on one level, probably not as deep as other families. But when we do hear people talk about the NDIS and caregiving stress, we can relate to them. And that's a part of being human. We need to be able to say, I can relate to you. I'm very sorry you're going through this. How can we make this better? And then we have, of course, families with that are supporting high needs children or adults. Their caregiving is like a 24-hour labour. They might have assistance here and there, but this is a 24-hour thing for them. So on top of that, if you add the bureaucratic instability, then of course you've got the funding uncertainty. You have reassessments that they do, and that reduces supports a lot of the time. I know a lot of people with children with high needs, and I would probably confidently say 99% of them have had issues with the NDIS in one way or another, and most of them are under financial stress. So we have all of this, the chronic stress, and all this chronic stress, you internalize it and it actually becomes psychological. It can become biological. You can develop illness from this. You can have a read up on that. It's completely true. It resonates or manifests in people as an illness. Of course, we have systemic pressure that that doesn't cause homicide, but the systemic pressure contributes to the cumulative risk that we spoke about earlier. Obviously, you're at a higher risk. If a caregiver feels that they're drowning financially, emotionally, administratively, and they perceive that there's no rescue or relief coming, then that feeling of hopelessness that we spoke about, it deepens. And hopelessness, as decades of suicide research confirms, is one of the strongest predictors of self-harm. I mean, honestly, how easy is it to just say, oh, evil parent, without kind of examining whether the system surrounding that family was stable or fragile? And prevention basically lives in fragility mapping. And also, I think a lot of the comments, saying that and being like parents are murderers are coming from people who, bless them, but they have not experienced anything that we've spoken about. I think a lot of the time, a lot of us who can understand can relate in one way or another, obviously not to its extreme level, but I think it does come from people who haven't experienced that. Otherwise, if it's from people who have experienced that, I honestly don't understand. I can't understand. But anyway, let's move on. I've put together this next segment called Affluence and the Illusion of Immunity. So Mosman Park, let's talk about it. This is an area of Perth that's quite nice and it's widely regarded as affluent, and the media loved that and they emphasised that very quickly. But I just want to say that postcode doesn't equal protection. Socioeconomic advantage can reduce certain stresses, of course. What's that? I've seen that meme floating around on social media, like money doesn't fix everything, but I'd rather cry in a Ferrari. I mean, like, yes, we would all love to cry in a Ferrari, but it does not eliminate problems. And to think that's the case is very, very sad. It doesn't eliminate mental illness or caregiver burnout or domestic strain or even psychological collapse. And I think that's very, very important in this case. In fact, actually, to back that up, there's research out there. I've included all of the studies that I've read to put this together for you, but there is research that does suggest that higher socioeconomic environments like Mosman Park can actually increase stigma, surprise, around help seeking. And this is obviously due to the reputation pressures and people being like, I've heard it a million times, people being like, there's people who need it more than me. Everybody says that. I don't think that's the case. I think if you need it, you need it. It doesn't matter where you come from. Affluence can conceal distress, and in this case it absolutely has, and large homes can contain silent suffering. Financial resources can't regulate a nervous system in collapse, and children's lives are not more shocking or more tragic because of property value. All children are equally irreplaceable and all families are equally complex, and I don't think that if this family lived in a tent down by the beach that it would be even sadder. I think you can't, place more value on one person's life than the next. And that's really, really important because responsibility and complexity can coexist. I know that there is fear in conversations like this, and it's exactly why I wanted to do this episode, because the fear is that contextualizing is excusing, but it's not. Responsibility does exist, and these children are dead and lives are permanently altered. People are really taking this as a heavy hit, especially parents with neurodiverse children or children with extra needs. Grief is immeasurable, but refusing to examine the contributing factors doesn't honour the victims at all. It actually protects the comfort of everybody, in and around Perth and across the country even. Criminology is not about moral absolutes. It's about the risk ecosystem. We always think when something like this happens, how could we prevent this from happening again? And there is an ecological systems theory from 1979 that does remind us that individuals exist within layers. We have, of course, the family layer. This is, where we're meant to be most comfortable and with the people we love the most. Then, of course, the next level up is the community. And then up from the community is institutions. Then we have policy and culture. And violence emerges from interaction across those layers. And if we collapse analysis into quote unquote bad person, we're literally severing that ecological model and we learn nothing. Now, the suicide component in this matters a lot. And in murder-suicide research, the suicide is not an afterthought. It's actually central. This is the first act, and the perpetrator dies. This is the first thought in their mind. So when the perpetrator dies, this obviously means no trial, no cross-examination, no full psychological reconstruction, which leaves a narrative vacuum. And a narrative vacuum fills quickly with moral shorthand, especially on social media, but understanding suicidal trajectory is essential. Now, we can obviously confirm that, this was a murder-suicide. I don't know why they call it, I guess I do. Never mind. But there was intention there. And, of course, when we are ruling a homicide, we have a look at intent, the intent to kill. And, obviously, this was at least planned out, right beforehand, if not long in advance, by the person who commit these crimes. It is obviously out of desperation and despair. They have left notes, and the person who did go to the home did read the note that said, don't enter and please call police. So that tells us that this, was planned, and they did think about whoever may stumble upon them first, which is it's just incredibly sad. The interpersonal theory of suicide, that was published in 2005. This actually proposes that suicide requires two components, okay? So the first component is the perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness. That's both of them. So they need to be, perceived as a burden, and they need to believe that they don't belong. And they combine this with the acquired capability for lethal self-harm. So imagine a caregiver, for example, experiencing that perceived burdensomeness, like I am failing, and then the thwarted belongingness, which is no one understands and no one is helping. So they just felt in despair and entirely hopeless. So the acquired capability obviously would refer to exposure to stress, pain, means, catastrophic thinking, exhaustion, hopelessness, like I said. This isn't speculation about this specific case. This is research-based risk architecture. And again, I keep saying the same thing, but if we refuse to talk about the suicide component, then we're missing the entire point. I'm also wanted to make this episode to inform you of all of the co-contributing factors for you to be able to make your own decisions about this case and moving forward. I don't feel comfortable to go into this case about who's involved and who did what. Obviously, we have two boys who were nonverbal and required extra assistance. And we have two beautiful, loving parents. And I think the whole point of this is, language, human core. And like I said online, I was really, really disappointed to see people online, talking about this tragedy, like reducing it to, child murderers, or saying that, you live in an area where you have, a lot of money, so that should have fixed everything. It's just such a profound misunderstanding of the case in itself and the realities of extreme burden of caregiving. Whether you are the parent and you love the people you're caring for endlessly, it doesn't take away the pressure and how difficult things can be. In, criminological and forensic terms, neither of these components exist in isolation like we spoke about. And it's hard. It's so hard for, family members and parents to have to care. And I know it is our inherent job to care for our children, but when there's extra needs, caring for children who don't have extra needs is difficult. You have your, good and bad days. To add that extra component of extra needs on top of that, it's incredibly difficult. It's so difficult. Then on top of that, the systemic issues and, not getting funding or getting funding and having it taken away and just feeling like there's no way out. It's incredibly sad. And, grief deserves this kind of depth. This family deserves this kind of depth, and they deserve to finally be able to rest peacefully and not have, their lives spoken about in vain, and the country pulling them apart and calling them things when they don't know them. You don't know what drove them to this or how hard it was for them. And aren't we so lucky to not know? Isn't that the whole point? That's why we're here and they're not, because we don't know. No suburb is immune, no family is immune, and no life, like I said, is more valuable because of a postcode. This is why language matters, you guys, and it's why systems matter, and this is why we examine the entire equation, not just the part that makes us feel morally clear. This is Exhuming the Truth. If you are struggling in Australia, please phone Lifeline on 13 11 14 or be on Blue 1300 22 4636. We have, of course, listed a bunch of references if you wanted to read further on anything that we spoke about today. I appreciate you so much for being here and for listening to this episode that was a little different than usual, but very, very important and just an essential conversation that we need to start having and stop using words like monster and evil and making it seem so out of this world. These were just people who, just days prior were just living quietly that we didn't know their names or their faces or their stories. These were people, not monsters. I encourage you to have a discussion around this and around all of the things that, are the barriers around this case and things that piled on top of this family. It's so important. It's important for crime prevention, and it's important to be able to speak about things openly and freely. My name is Asha. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have enjoyed it, and if so, you can stay up to date across all social media platforms. You can subscribe for less than $2 a month on our Facebook page to help us help families across Australia. My name is Asha, and this is Exhuming the Truth. Have a beautiful day.